Welcome back to Sampstra Games, the place to find new strategy games, and today I have a guide for you on a Warhammer 40,000 Battlesector. We're going to talk about which units you should pick for different missions. We're going to talk about the weaknesses and strengths of each unit and then how to set up your very own squad. Now, in this particular guide, I'm going to be focusing only on the basic units, so essentially units that you can unlock within the first 6 missions of the game. And then if you're interested, I could make a separate guide on more advanced units and how to pick your squad when you're kind of further into the game and going through more advanced enemies and etc. But now we're just going to focus on the basics and essentially on the beginning. So how is this guide going to work? Well, I'm going to start off by giving you some basic information that you need to know before you make your squad and your army. Then we're going to talk about each unit. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about how I actually pick my squad for these missions. There will be timestamps below, so if you want, you can jump to a specific section. But if you watch the whole way through, the YouTube king, also known as the algorithm, will smile upon me. Now that's enough chit-chatting. Let's start with the basics. So here on the left, you can see a list of units that you have unlocked. If you click on them, you can see all the information you need about a unit, and you can add it to your army, to units under command that you have on the right by simply clicking this button, add unit to army. Now, what's important are these two numbers, 1,215 points and 17 out of 20. So this is just the number of units that you can add under your command, and this is how many points your whole command costs. Anytime you click on a unit, you can see how many points it costs you to add under your command here. Now here you have no point limit. Actually, it doesn't matter. The way this game works is that you create your units under your command, and then when you actually go into a specific mission, you will be able to choose a subset from these units under your command. So it's really important that you have a lot of good options here, because for example, if I don't put in my list any land speeder, as I don't have right now, I will not be able to add the land speeder mission unit into my mission because I just don't have that option. So keep that in mind. Alright, so here you can see the actual mission assignment of your unit. So up here you can see the number of points that you're allowed to use, which is 1,100, and how much you have over limit. So this here is essentially the units per command that you picked, and now from this set you can pick a subset of the units that you want to use. If you don't want to use a unit, you just change this deployed over here to undeployed, and it disappears here from the map and it gets grayed out, which means you aren't going to use it, and now you're less over limit. Now, if you bought yourself some upgrades, you might be able to change the weapons. For example, these Intercessors have bolt rifle, but I can actually change it for auto bolt rifle. However, changing the weapons will change the amount of points, so it might make them more expensive or less expensive if you had equipped the higher thing. Then what you can do is you can grab these units over here and you can click and drag to move them around. Now, what I like to do is I like to make sure that these Furioso Dreadnoughts or any units that only have one model and a lot of HP are kind of on the sides, front and back, so that if the enemy attacks, they're going to be the most likely targets. And the reason for that is because one model is a much better tank than multiple models. We're going to talk about a little bit more about why that is later in this guide. Now, one more thing I like to do here is I like to make sure that I optimize for the limit as much as possible. For example, if I were to take away these Hellblasters, I would be okay with my limit, but the disadvantage is I have a lot of points remaining. I only need 5 more in order to actually be able to get additional units, so this is probably not the best choice for me. For example, if I were to then change this auto bolt rifle back to regular rifle, I could get 1 more set of either Intercessors or assault squad or whatever. So we always want to make sure that you optimize this in the best possible way, and then you try to have as little points remaining as possible. Okay, once you're happy, you're just going to click proceed and you can start the mission. Another important thing to note is that units do kind of carry over between missions, but there's no particular effect of it, except for this. This is a brand new unit. If I click on this, you can see that this campaign history is nothing here. If I click on these Hellblasters, they have a high campaign history because they were in a lot of other missions, so I can see here in which missions they were a part of. It has no actual effect on picking a unit for an army except for this. You will have to pay the full amount of points in order to put them in, as we saw in the previous segment, and there is no like benefit or anything like that. Also keep in mind that every unit heals to full HP. When you start a new mission, everyone is at full HP. It doesn't matter if you lost some models, if you lost some HP in the previous mission, they're going to be like brand new, just like if it was a brand new unit that didn't have any campaign history. The only difference are really just these medals that you can see if you click on these units. Now, before we talk about different units, I want to talk about two main types of damage that you'll find in this game. This is just my own naming. It's not named this way in the game, but I think it's really important to understand the distinction. So you can have this sort of like one-hit damage, and essentially these are units or heroes that hit very strongly one model, because in this game each unit is split into models, and this is very important because each model has its own HP. And how much damage a unit does dependent on how many models they have left. If you want to know more about that, I have a guide for 5 basic tips for Warhammer. You can click on the right top to watch it after this video. But like I said, there's an option to do like one high amount of damage to a single model. This is typical for your heroes, for example, like Lieutenant Carlon or Brother Kindar and etc. And they're going to be able to do a lot of damage once. So for example, 70 damage, but only to a single model. Now, if you're fighting someone like Termagants, where the enemy has 7 models, but each only have like 20 or 25 HP, that's not much. So this one attack, one big hit attack, is going to do a lot of damage, but it's useless because it will still only kill one model out of the 70 models in the Termagant unit. But this is really powerful if you're fighting an enemy unit that is really strong, like Tyrannofaxes or Exocrine or etc., that has like a lot of HP, like 300. So that's like the one big hit units. And then you have other units, like for example Intercessors, that do like sort of like a disperse damage, like they spread the damage between all the enemies. Essentially they, for example, do, let's say, 2 to 3 damage, but they do it 20 times or 40 times. And this will allow them to disperse the damage between, for example, a lot of Termagant units, because they can do a lot of tiny damage to all of them. However, this is typically not useful against an enemy with one big model, like Tyrannofax, because they have good armor. So then if you try to hit them with the Intercessors, you're only going to be able to do like 0 to 0 damage, so essentially nothing. So as we're going to go through the basic units, we're going to talk about a unit that's good for like one big hit and a unit that's good for spreading damage. So first unit we're going to talk about are Intercessors. So Intercessors are very cheap units, one of the cheapest, just like the Assault Squad and Land Speeders. In the basic version it only costs 70 points. Intercessors are very good for ranged and damage and essentially spread damage. Now, they have an ability called Battle Line Tactics, which you can research for, which allows them to increase the range damage they do, but the price of it is that if an enemy attacks them in melee, they'll take more damage. Now, you can also get an ability of Frag Grenade, which allows them to do a sort of like that one big hit range damage. You can throw a grenade, which will allow you to hit a little bit stronger. It's not going to be like super strong, but it will allow you to do some damage to these one model enemy units if you wanted to. But the idea with Intercessors is that you really want to have a specialized ranged unit. So you want to keep them safe, you want to keep them protected at a distance, but you can use them to hit a lot of these smaller enemy units like the Termagants and Hermagants that have a lot of models with small amount of HP, and the Intercessors will allow you to drop them quite nicely, or at least do a lot of damage to them. Next, let's talk about the Assault Squad. The Assault Squad also costs only 70 points. And this is kind of like a mirror unit to the Intercessors. Just like the Intercessors are good for range, the Assault Squad is good for melee. So, they have a chainsword, and they also have a bolt pistol, but the bolt pistol is not very good. Like, they can do some range damage, but it's not going to be very useful. Instead, you want to use them for melee attacks. Are very good at these one big hits for enemy units with just one model. And they also have an ability called Assault Tactics, which is again kind of like the mirror to what the Intercessors have. It allows them to increase their melee accuracy and melee damage, but in exchange, if they get hit by a ranged attack, they will take more damage. Now, in order to get to melee, they actually have to get into towards the enemy, so you can use a jump pack to essentially fly closer to the enemy. One thing to keep in mind though is that you want to use them to do charge attacks. You can do a charge attack if you're attacking in a straight line. So ideally, if you can run at the enemy without using the jump pack, it's actually more beneficial, because the benefit of charge is actually that you get a bonus and the enemy does not hit back. Now, you can get a research that allows you to get a crag grenade, and this is something that will allow you to do one big hit ranged attack on the assault squad as well. This is something that I, for example, recommend because I think the assault squad is a really good unit. If you can get the crag grenade, you can make them a little bit more balanced, and you have that ability to hit strongly at these like one model enemy units, but it's not completely necessary. It also has splash, so it will allow you to hit a little bit more. If the enemy has, for example, 3 models, it will allow you to do a little bit of damage like that to all 3 of them as well. Land speeders. Now, land speeders are a very cheap unit, just like the other ones mentioned. They only cost 70 points. And they essentially work as scouter. They can be used as scouts because they have a lot of movement, 2 more than the assault squad, for example, and you can get an extra upgrade that gives you even more movement. And they have a high awareness cone, which means you'll be able to see very far, which allows you to tell where the enemies are, which can be quite useful. They're a single model, so they could be used for tanking, but I don't feel like they're that good for tanking because they're mostly for like ranged attack, and if you leave them alone with an enemy, they can get hurt pretty quickly, like a stronger enemy like Venom Throps, for example. I personally don't like them and don't use them, but it has been pointed out to me that they're very cheap, and they can be substituted for example, the Furioso Dreadnought, which is a unit that I love. I'll talk about it later. But if you didn't like that unit, you could use multiple land speeders as a sort of like a tank-ish scout unit so that you can move forward, kind of see the enemy, and they should theoretically survive if the rest of your army can catch up quickly enough to be able to drop whoever's attacking them. Hellblasters are a little bit more expensive than the other units that we've talked about. They cost 90 points. They have the same HP as Intercessors, so the HP is not too high, but the main benefit is the range of their weapons. So they're using a plasma incinerator, which does quite a lot of damage. Now the damage can be spread into multiple units, but it can also work as sort of like a one hit against a single model. So they're kind of balanced in the sense that they work both on tiny units and on big ones. And the plasma incinerator, it has a range to 9, so it has a really, really big range. And this is huge because you can hit enemies while they're very far away and they actually won't have a shot at you because the range is much smaller. Or if they do, the attack is going to be very low because it's not in their good range. So this is a really cool thing about the Hellblasters. I like to use them essentially as the snipers or like the big attack for enemies that are far away. You can also get some cool abilities to upgrade their HP and etc. And you can also get supercharged, which allows you to increase their ranged damage, but they have a chance of hitting themselves back. So that can be a bit rough, but it can be useful if you really need that extra damage. Aggressors are probably the most balanced of units in the sense that they can do both a good ranged attack and a good melee attack. So they can do a good damage either way, which I think is quite useful. They also have a pretty good HP, 110, so this means that they will be able to last a couple attacks. They can essentially take the damage for themselves if that's needed. Now, one thing to keep in mind though is that they cost 135 points, so essentially they're for the price of 2 Intercessors or 2 Assault Squads. So always want to ask yourself a question, is it worth it? Because especially in the starting missions, they're going to be more, I guess, limited by points than by number of units that you can have. So I feel like it might be better to actually substitute 1 aggressor for maybe 2 intercessors or something like that. And now let's talk about Furioso Dreadnought. This is an amazing unit. This unit has 300 HP, but it has a single model. This is huge because if you only have 1 model with a lot of HP, that means that this unit can tank very effectively. So just like you can do the spread damage or the one big hit damage, your enemies can do that as well. For example, the Exocrine can do a lot of damage, and if it's spread between small units, like let's say the Intercessors, it can essentially drop entire unit in a single hit. But if you have the Furioso Dreadnought, it can actually absorb a lot of the damage with... Now, one thing to always keep in mind is that if you have less models than your maximum, you're going to be doing less damage. If you have only 3 models out of 5, you'll be doing less damage. But if you have only 1 model, it doesn't matter whether it has 300 HP or 100 HP, it will always do the same amount of damage. So this is the reason why you want to make sure that your 1 model units are tanking. Now, all of your heroes usually have a lot of HP, so they can work as this 1 unit tank, but I always find that it's useful to have a couple of these dreadnoughts, or at least 1, to help out to sort of tank and take the damage for themselves. They have a good damage as well. Both their Stormbolter can do a pretty nice spread out damage, and their Furioso Fists are very good at doing that 1 big hit damage, so they're balanced in that sense. They also have a volatile ability where they explode. However, the big drawback of the Dreadnoughts, they cost 165, so essentially they're the price of almost 3 Intercessors or Assault Squad. So this is a really disadvantage, but I would recommend to have at least 1 of them per mission, especially if you feel like in the mission the enemy is going to have some of these big units like... Okay, now let me show you how I pick the units for my squad. So typically I like to go with around 3 Assault Squad and around 3 Intercessors. It's kind of like my base. Then I like to have 1, sometimes 2, these Furioso Dreadnoughts. Then around 2 Hellblasters, and I typically go for 1 Aggressor. Sometimes you can go with 2. I typically don't put any land speeders in my mission because, like I said, I don't like them. I find that the other units are just like more useful, but obviously that's up to you. And then fill out the rest with whatever is your preference. Just make sure that it's always filled out so that you have a lot of options when you go into the specific mission. But this subset that I've shown you so far is typically the one I choose. Maybe once you go a bit further in the missions, you might want to take a few more Hellblasters because they're just really, really good, and it's probably the best unit so far. Now, before we end this guide, I want to know how you use the units mentioned and which one is your favorite. Also, if you enjoyed this, you might like my other guide for the 5 basic tips for Warhammer, as I mentioned, or you can watch my Let's Play of Warhammer 40,000 Battlesector. You can click on the right bottom here. The first 6 missions are in the beta, but then we transitioned to a full release, so you can just continue watching the newer episodes there. There'll be a link after you finish that first playlist. Alright, and also, if you'd like, you can watch my Warhammer 40,000 Mechanicus playlist as well. There'll be a link to that in the description. Enough chit-chatting? Have a fun playing. Bye bye.